Okay, let's say I was to say to you, that copper is bent. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there are possibly two meanings, aren't there? There's that police officer is corrupt, or that police officer is gay. Now, the thing there is, the first meaning is highly defamatory. To suggest a police officer is guilty of corruption would probably be held to be defamatory without much further proof of serious harm, because it would tend to cause serious harm. But if you just said somebody was gay, the test for defamation is, would it lower your reputation or cause people to shun and avoid you in the minds of right-minded people? And the way defamation works, they say, well, no, right-minded people wouldn't be bothered that somebody was gay. I mean, the mere fact that people might be, it doesn't count. There's a case on that, actually, from where somebody in a social club, somebody tipped people off about something dodgy at the social club, so they put a notice up saying so-and-so and so-and-so is a grass. And the person sued, and they said, well, no, you can't sue that, because right-minded people would, of course, always inform the police of illegal activities at their social club. So that's the test there. But this ambiguity between the two potential meanings highlights a big problem in defamation law. And it's one that I've noticed people have picked up on in the comments. And the actual courts share your scepticism. So what am I talking about? Well, when people are saying, about defamation, we have this meaning rule where, we have what we call the single meaning rule. In other words, it doesn't matter that there are multiple potential meanings. The court goes with the meaning that they think the average reasonable hypothetical viewer or reader or listener, the test is not too open to gossip, but not too naive either. It's what do they think? So if there are several possible reasonable interpretations, it doesn't matter. They just pick the one that they think is the obvious one. And clearly that can be slightly unsatisfactory. And I noticed you've picked up on that in a lot of the comments saying, well, actually, no, me and my friends or everybody I know would interpret it in the non-defamatory way. But that's not the test. But this is a major problem. Now, interestingly, in malicious falsehood, it's a different test. Now, first of all, what's malicious falsehood? Malicious falsehood is where you say a statement that is untrue, and it's calculated to cause loss to another person. But the key difference between malicious falsehood and defamation is the statement, the allegation doesn't have to be one that would lower your opinion. It's probably easy to give an example. You ring me and say, hey Al, have you got Dan Shensmith's number? Because I would like to instruct the black belt barrister. And I say, sorry, Dan's out doing his charity work at the moment, so he's not available, but I am. Now, obviously, it's not defamatory to say somebody does charity work. However, if Dan was actually available, and that's just a lie, and I've done that either to cost Dan the work or to gain the work for myself, that's the elements of malicious falsehood. But in malicious falsehood, they don't have the single meaning rule. Now, somebody tried to actually argue that it should be introduced. It should be the same as defamation. But the court came back and said, well, yeah, if it should be the same as defamation, it should be that we get rid of the single meaning rule. And what they actually said was, there's very little justification for the single meaning rule. And let's face it, if we were setting out the laws of defamation from scratch today, nobody would bother introducing that because it's so silly and artificial. Because in malicious falsehood, all you have to show is there's a meaning that a reasonable number of people could have come to. So it doesn't matter that there are multiple meanings, one of which is untrue. If you can point to one and say, well, actually, you can interpret it that way, and it is true, then that's a defence. But we don't have that in defamation. However, it gets even more complicated. But the reason I'm doing this is, so next time you're on Twitter, you can sort of go, yes, well, what's going on there is, because some of these things do seem incomprehensible. But if you are putting forward a defence of truth, and you say, what I say is true, and there is a meaning of that phrase that is true, well, if the court finds that actually, no, we're going to go with a different meaning and one that you can't defend, you're fairly stuffed, because you say, well, I actually intended it to mean the non-defamatory one. And they say, well, we don't care what you intended it to mean. We just do the test by what would, your average reasonable person mean. However, a different rule applies if you are running a defence of what we call qualified privilege. Now, qualified privilege is where you make a statement and you either have a duty to make that statement or the recipient of the statement has a legitimate interest in hearing what you have to say. I mean, the classic example is job references. Because, you're expected to be honest in job references. But what if you make a mistake and you do get something wrong? Well, qualified privilege can only be defeated if you can prove malice. And that's malice in the defamation sense. So that's knowing it's not true or not caring whether it's true or not. And if you're raising malice as a defence, so you might fail on your truth defence, but you raise your qualified privilege defence, and then they actually do the multiple meanings thing, and they say, okay, notwithstanding we found that for the truth defence it means this and only this, and we're going to do it in an objective sense. We're not going to say, what did you think? We're going to say, what would an average person think? But when it comes to, did you honestly believe it was true, or were you reckless? Then they will say, well, as long as you can put forward a meaning that actually isn't defamatory, and you can say that's what I believed, it's very hard to defeat malice, then that will be a defence. So yeah, I mean, like I say, it's a strange rule, and I'm surprised actually that the courts haven't of their own volition started to expand that, or and just say, as a matter of common sense, then people, multiple interpretations are possible, and in order to defend your good name, you can just sort of say, well, actually, they weren't accusing me of something. I mean, that's the irony in defamation. The claimant always tries to make out that they're being accused of the most horrendous things possible, and the defendant always tries to say, no, what I said to you wasn't even slightly demeaning or insulting or would lower your reputation. You've clearly misunderstood it. And this is becoming more and more in Twitter. I mean, it's also the context, because like to go back to the copper example, I mean, on the bare bones of it, if I just printed that statement, PC so-and-so is bent, with no other context, then it might be the court would say that's clearly an allegation of corruption. But what if I was just sort of, we were commenting about how people dress, and say, oh, he dresses rather flamboyantly, or something like that. Then you could say, well, look at the context. Clearly we were talking about issues like that, and that's why my comment was there. Whereas if you're just watching an old episode of The Sweeney or something, go, oh, that's a bent copper, then clearly you probably mean it in the old sort of West Midlands Serious Crime Squad sense, going back a bit there. Older viewers might remember all that scandal. So yeah, I just thought that might be useful for you, because a lot of defamation law is quite counterintuitive, because it's a hodgepodge of various acts of parliament and various interpretations by the courts, and that is why it is such a specialist area, just because of all these little nuances. But I'm hoping now that when you follow a defamation story on social media or something, you'll be able to understand what's going on and say, right, I can see now why they're applying the single meaning rule, because the defence is truth. But over here, this is a defence of qualified privilege, or even public, public interest or opinion. And say, actually, no, they're applying the subjective test to that element, because that's a different defence. So there you go. Anyway, as always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting, vaguely accurate. Before I forget, I'm going to say it now, because Dan always says, you've got to say, please like and subscribe. So please consider liking, subscribing, sharing. Where am I today? This is a place called Wheel Busy, which is, unsurprisingly, an old tin mine. And it's on what we call the Great Flat Lode, which was an area, it's just basically just tons of tin really near the surface, spread out for lots of square miles. So that's why there's so many engine sheds and mining activity. Before I moved to Cornwall, I assumed there'd be like 3 of those wheelhouses, and they were always the same ones on the postcards. And then when you actually move down here, you realise you just can't move for the things. There's hundreds of them. But yeah, what I'll do is I'll get out of the way so you can see that rather nice chimney, and I'll try and get some better pictures of it so it's not all bent, because I use a fisheye lens.